Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History 113. So, today we're going to be continuing part of our Module 2 lecture, which is called Framing the Political Narrative, in the sense where we're really trying to identify how the political has been um, approached, ganyan, how topics of political history have been approached both on an international level, but also on the specific level of Philippine history, right? So let's look at what we've studied so far. In this module, we started with an introduction. And in the introduction, we looked at how Philippine history is framed. So we looked at the dominant. Well, first we described what the meta narrative is and what its role is in framing the kind of story that we're trying to tell. For instance, we have the national meta narrative, where the objective is to write a story or write a narrative that will contribute to our understanding of the emergence of the Philippine nation state or of the nation state. So we also talked about the key characterizations of mainstream Philippine history o yung pangkaraniwang kasaysayan. Ibig sabihin nito ay ito yung mga mahanap natin sa textbooks or ito yung mga mas dominant na interpretations na mahanap mo in mass media sometimes. But also textbooks that have not really been updated to more current historical research. So, these tendencies, the center on the national narrative, the tendency for this to be political history, and the tendency to rely on primarily archival materials, we're not saying these aren't important. We're saying that we need to expand our horizons past these central tendencies. So, yes, these are important, but we have to add to them. We have to look at more areas other than the Manila and Tagalog centric regions. We have to look at other methods of history that look past the nation state and talk about the wider problem of power dynamics in the past. And instead of looking at primarily archival materials, we're also trying to look at other sources of history like materials, like artifacts, or even oral histories, and so on and so forth. So, as you can see, the key characterizations of mainstream Philippine history, as I was arguing for in the past submodule, tend to be traditional political history, or it looks like traditional political history. So we kind of talked about that and looked at how some of these tendencies are still carried over even in the UP system syllabus, although there are many ways that we've tried to move past the dominant political narrative. It's really hard to distance yourself from that when our objective is to write about the Philippine nation state, diba? So if you look at different professors and the way they handle this subject, they're actually sometimes going to privilege more cultural experiences and social experiences or economic experiences. It just so happens that I tend to have more training in political history, and so that's the edge that I take. So, moving past that, our key question was, how do we frame Philippine history then as other than national history? What are other ways to imagine the scope of national history, the subjects that we can study, or even the space in which national history takes place? Diba? So, in answering that question, our first stop was to talk about three international models or frames. We can even think about them as perspectives, which inform us of dominant trends in overall international historiography, right? So we talked about the French Annals School, the Indian Subaltern School, and the Cornell Third Way or Area Studies program, which shifted the way we think about historical writing. Now, to summarize, what did the French Annals School contribute to our knowledge of historical writing? Well, in addition to the many methods of analysis that they introduced, which we can't go through one by one here, they also they also advocated for total history. Remember that total history is the attempt to encompass as wide a range of people and as wide a range of experiences, so that when you're writing about history, it's about a total human experience rather than a more political experience. So the Indian Subaltern School tried to look for more local narratives or alternative narratives that could speak for those people who were simply left out of history as outcasts who didn't even really have a big role to play or were traditionally seen as not having a role to play in the construction of institutions such as the nation state. And the Cornell Third Way or Area Studies program showed us how to kind of distance ourselves from the political agenda colonization of colonization as well as the political agenda sometimes inherent in national historical writing, where we might be prone to mythologizing or creating these big stories about our past that, when you look at the data, like the evidence, might not actually be fully supported. So yun yung tatlong tinignan nating international frames. And we looked at their history and key ideas and some authors. So today, as a follow up to that, we're going to zoom into the Philippine space and look at how authors, both international and national, I guess, and domestic, have written about political subjects. So, how are we going to approach this today? No? First, we're going to try to tie in what you already know about the sample strands of Philippine history. And then we're going to proceed to summarizing some tendencies in the writing of Philippine history by introducing you to authors and their work and what their work represents in terms of trends in historical writing. Okay, so let's summarize or try to connect what we previously learned about the strands of Philippine history. Now, we know that each kind of historical writing represented here coincides with a period in our past, right? What periods might those be? So colonial histories evidently coincide with our colonial experiences both under the Spanish and under the Americans, who had different methods of historical writing, but ultimately you can see this trend that exists in both both categories, where there's a justification for the subjugation of the Philippine Islands, whether that's due to the need to Christianize or due to the need for economic extraction on the part of the colonizers, or even due to the need to civilize as the Americans interpreted their duty in the Philippines. So, moving past that, no, when we look at another form of historical writing that emerged or in between those two colonial periods, we find that Ilustrado Filipino proto-histories are actually quite interesting. They're interesting in the sense that with a wide range of materials you find appearing here, from historical analysis in articles to annotations in books written by the Spanish, or even in actual historical books that were written, all of these materials were trying to they were like reflexive exercises where people who were colonized, who had a complex identity, were trying to say that they belong to a collective that didn't really formally have a name yet. Was it going to be called the Katagalugan? Was it going to be called the Filipino? Was it the Indio Bravo? Like, what was this new identity information exactly? And how would it look? Who would it encompass? So, kaya interesting yung Ilustrado Filipino Proto-Histories natin kasi sila yung mga naghanap ng, or sila yung humubog ng konsepto ng kung ano nga ba ang Pilipino. And although that's still a process that's continuing up to the present day, these were the first people who really thought about it and committed it to paper, and therefore left a paper trail that could be shared by word of mouth or could be read about. And so we find the traces of the emergence of Philippine nationalism in those work. So after that, no, when we finally achieved independence from the Americans in 1946, we start to see the emergence of a form of historical writing called official or state-sponsored history. So there are so many official or state-sponsored histories, even up until the present day, diba? So this isn't a bound period. But especially after World War II, there was a distinct reason for writing for writing the history of the nation state. There are many reasons. One reason might be you want to convince the people within the nation state that they should feel allegiance to and loyalty to that institution. Similar to what the Americans did when they were teaching Filipinos history written by them, and they were showing Filipinos how they could achieve a higher level of civilization, similar to the Americans or Western society, if they were educated in that way, following that historical trajectory. Diba? So, under the post war period, writing about history and teaching it through our public school system was a way for these writers, whether, driven by political motivation or not, to tell us who we were as a nation and therefore what we should value. So often, diba, when there's a commemoration for Rizal or other national heroes, the tendency is to use them as figures to forward present day action. Let us educate ourselves like Rizal. Let's take education seriously. Let's make sure that the pen is mightier than the sword, and you should be disciplined. It's really funny, the level or the number of places you find Rizal's face appearing in, just to become the poster boy for one or another moral value that is being pushed upon the public, diba? So parang ganon, yun yung metaphor for official or state-sponsored histories. History as a vehicle for forwarding how they think people should act and how they should feel about their own national identity. And, beyond that, of course, history was also being used as a way to assert to the international community that, yes, we have a history and we've developed to a certain point that puts us on the same level as other modern members of the nation, of the international community of nation states. So we'll talk about that a little more when we go to the emergence of the Filipino nation state, right? So, as an interesting but also confusing category, we also know about nationalist histories, which were essentially reactions to official or state sponsored histories where, the tendency was to focus on elites and to forward state values or the values of the administrations in charge. So the nationalist historians are not just people who believe in writing about national history as an important perspective. They were people who were introducing alternative modes of analysis where they privileged or started to um, rediscover ganyan, or reintroduce the role of the Philippine masses in our own revolution and other interesting themes. No? So, alam natin na they have their own brand of historical writing. And then, of course, kind of as a reaction to all of the stuff happening at the time, these historians who were looking at Southeast Asia from the vantage point of the post World War II era, were saying they want to write history that is neither colonial nor anti colonial. They simply wanted to write history in a way that looked past the categories of nations as containers. So we'll talk about that more. We actually talked about that in module 2.1, right? Okay, so where does that lead us today? What are we doing now? Our objective for the next couple of slides is to look at the Philippine trends in historical writing in the post-war period specifically. So some of them have already been introduced a little bit, but we're going to really delve into what names you probably want to remember, how we generally describe these themes of history, and maybe sometimes some questions that were important to them. So, although this cannot be a very deep discussion, I will be giving you just a bit of foundation in Philippine historiography, what names and what questions have mattered in the past couple of years.